Allow me to share my screen and welcome back if you joined us yesterday as well for the IoT session. Some of you may be relieved to hear that I'm only actually on voice, as it were, for the next 30 minutes. And then I've called in some reinforcements actually to do a deep dive into the actual demoing of insider risk. So we have got a tenant all set up with a couple of suspicious employees, and Ali will be taking you through that once I've sort of set the scene, as it were, with some slides to give us all a bit of a framework to see how this demo is actually being hung for us. So I'll leap straight in. And we will be around for a good few hours, by the way, as well. So if you have got any questions as we step through these slides and then, of course, step through the demo as well, then please do type them in. We will try and answer them if we can. But there is a team of us on the back end, as it were, responding to these questions as they come in. And it gives us something, obviously, then to talk about with the greater audience then as well. So first off, in my views at least, what is IRM? So IRM's actually been used several times throughout the last few decades in Microsoft as an acronym, but today it's insider risk or insider risk management, and you can view it from two aspects. One, what actually is it? Well, it's actually an engine that runs in the cloud, because of course everything does in Microsoft, inside Azure, and it takes a load of inputs and then decides if anything suspicious is happening. So it's a learning algorithm, therefore the machine learning algorithm that does this for us and sifts through all that data to produce those alerts as when we see them. And then as I was thinking to myself, well, don't we do this already? And there's thousands of ML routines, it appears these days, all running in different parts of our business. And there is, and we do, but not quite into where we're sort of looking or investigating today. So we've been doing it for quite a long time for identity. So every time we log on, there's a couple of ML routines that run to check you are who you really say you are. It checks how fast you type in your password. It checks which IP address and which geolocation you're coming from. And we've been doing that for some time as well. We do something very similar on devices as well. We know if you're an attacking PC, if you've got malware on your PC through lots of different methods actually. And again, there's routines in place to measure the fact that you've come in from a healthy device or even a compliant device. For a good few years, we've been doing applications as well. So we check to make sure you're using the correct application. If policy states a certain application has to be used, like Outlook for email, then we can do that through various services as well. And then we come to the bottom of the pile, as it were, perhaps the most interesting element, which is how do we know you're the right person to be accessing this data? What's to stop you copying it and taking it somewhere else, or altering it, or publishing it, or printing it, or sticking it onto a USB key? And so that's the area we're going to start talking about today. And why? And why is this important? So when you start reading about insider risk, and there is a very nice set of pages, by the way, as there are for most of our products now on docs.microsoft.com. If you search up insider risk, you'll find the top pages there. And one of them talks about emotional stressors as a driver for insider risk, which is a great term. So what is an emotional stressor? Well, let's pretend you've just had your annual review, your pay review. Hasn't gone quite as planned. Despite your huge efforts over the last 12 months, the company doesn't quite seem to recognize the fantastic contribution you've made. So you're thinking, well, if they don't want me, I'll find somewhere else. And then you start thinking about, well, perhaps you've had a very bad review and a journalist comes knocking on your door one day saying, do you know what's coming next on the roadmap for X, Y, or Z? These are all the emotional stressors. So perhaps there are other ones, not just interview review type ones, but perhaps you're under pressure from other aspects or other angles within your job, and therefore these start to lead to stressors on employees. Or what makes a normal employee, if there is such a thing, what makes a normal employee start to become a risk to the company. And then, of course, with any nice presentation, we have some stats. And these aren't our numbers, at least. So the first obviously is from Gartner, and the second one from a study that Deloitte did. But 23%, or if you round that up a little bit, about a quarter of information leaks are now done by a malicious insider. So this is an employee or someone with an account anyway. So let's wrap them all under the banner of an employee, has purposely leaked information or done something with the information, of course, they shouldn't have been able to do. So if that's a quarter, you do wondering where the other 75% actually occur, but at least that's one number we can start to have lodged in our memory. And the other one I think is an interesting number, 59%. That's the number of people who have taken data from one job to another. So if you've been offered a new role, let's say you're at Microsoft and you've been offered a role in Amazon, not that I have, but just in case, 59% of us would actually take some data with us. And in my mind, that's thinking, well, that means probably 41% are probably lying. Because if we did a poll now on the audience, I'm almost certain that all of us, if we've changed company, would have taken some data between those locations or between those different companies. And if we move on, there are plenty of other stressors or events or areas where it can cause an employee start to become a risk to the company as opposed to an asset. So we have a few there, of course, as well. I'll let you read through those for a couple of seconds just to give some idea of why, of course, the IRM is going to be existing. So just make sure this demo is going to come on. And what's built up from this? So this is possibly a nice area to look at as well. As Lisa was mentioning, we do have lots of different areas into this particular space. So let me just click through and start looking. So some of you, and this is acronym soup time, by the way, as well. We're not expecting anyone to actually remember these or get examined on them, but we have Microsoft Information Protection. The story that Lisa was telling earlier about XP details leaking out, that actually birthed Azure Information Protection, which was called RMS at the beginning, Rights Management Services. So as you can see, we're very good at reinventing the three-letter acronym, essentially meaning, of course, the same thing as we go through. Under Microsoft Information Protection, what does it actually do? Well, there's some sensitive information types in there. So how do we actually start automatically classifying documents? So we have a whole scanning engine, classification engine. You can train your own ones, of course, as well now. That's a recent update. But to give you some idea, if you want to go and automatically start classifying documents, then you can. And you can do that against pretty much any information source now. When we say any, of course, we mean in the office world, so things like SharePoint and Exchange, to start classifying that data as required. And we can do some other labels. So when we talk about sensitivity labels, we use some very poor examples actually on this particular screen of public and non-public. They work much better when you think about team-based labels instead. So this bit of work, or this document I'm producing, is for me only. So only I can access the document. Okay. In most companies, of course, that's not often the case. Mostly it'll be your team or your project team or your immediate team that has access. So if you have team name as in the label you want to attach to the document, or you have your company name or the business unit name. So rather than make your employees try and guess what's confidential and what's not, you just set the audience type instead, and that's where we can then start setting labels around those different audience types. Of course, a lot of this applies to Office 365. In fact, most of this is now built into Office 365 as soon as it gets installed onto your various clients. And of course, there's the common set of clients that get applied as well. So most of this does all work across Windows, Mac, and iOS, and increasingly even Android these days as well. So that takes us through, let's say, file storage or email storage, if you can call that a file as well. And then we move up into the world of web-based applications as well. Can we start putting policies around information being leaked into things like Dropbox or we've got their ServiceNow or Salesforce, for example, as well. So we have our own CASB or cloud application security, and this allows us to then obviously do some policies around how your employees can actually access these. What's to stop me downloading or uploading, I suppose, a load of information into Box or maybe it's my G Drive, Google Drive, and then making that publicly accessible. So those are the types of policies you can enforce through MCAS. Whoops, which has now disappeared. Let's bring that one back. We have the old name is still in force for the moment. So some of you may be aware of AIP, Azure Information Protection. I'm not quite sure what's happening here. The scanner is the important part. You can download an exe to run on a server, and that will hunt things like file shares and on-prem SharePoint boxes. for information then it can then start to classify as well. So if you start to want an inventory or a data set of what documents or data sets you have, then IRP Scanner is a great little tool to go off and actually build that for you. Over time, the suspicion is this AIP will slowly get smaller and smaller and smaller, and the functionality will be bled into MIP as that sort of master scanning classification engine. And this MIP engine, as we step through, there's not many slides, by the way, but as we step through the remaining slides, we'll see that this is the core engine that backs up a lot of our compliance policies and enables lots of other services, such as IRM, to actually work as well. We also have Endpoint DLP. It's sort of semi-linked into Defender for Endpoint, which some of you may be aware we talked yesterday. And when we mentioned yesterday that Microsoft has quite a rich ecosystem that all talk to each other of products and features and services, this is what we mean. So Endpoint is part of compliance. As we were chatting yesterday, Endpoint is also part of IoT now as well. So you see how it starts to share telemetry, starts to share intelligence between those different services. I think there's one more to come there, but we'll come back to that moment. Well, we'll build it out now. So, there it is. Bluetooth and things like RDP protection are coming in now as well. Now, admittedly, this is Windows at the moment, very heavily Windows flavored as opposed to Mac or Android, but the functionality will bleed over eventually. And this gives us a set of controls so we can then start applying to those endpoints as well. If you want to stop Fred leaving the company filled with a nice USB drive of information, then you can put a policy down that actually stops that happening or alerting for when that does happen, so you can stop him by other means. This is all great, what we've touched on so far, but it's all very file-based or email-based. So the next evolution then is Purview, so an Azure service, and this will start looking at sort of non-structured data, as it were, or more, in better terms, into database structures. So we'll look at things like SQL databases, Azure, Amazon S3 sources as well, and it will start to do something similar. It will map out what data exists within an organization. It will then start to classify that information and give you a whole set of tools around manipulating access then or reporting on who's accessing that information types as well. Not just the security tool. In fact, primarily it's for data and AI people to figure out what information they've actually got within the company. So obviously information is often an asset within most organizations now. So Purview gives you a catalog of all your assets. A byproduct almost is it gives us the ability from a security and compliance perspective to start measuring, monitoring and controlling access into those same sources. Again, all of this, as we'll see in a couple of slides time as well, starts to map into insider risk and e-discovery as well, which are part of the same offering under the same sort of umbrella, which we'll show as we go through. So that's the background we're working to. All this is in existence. Well, to be fair, Purview we're going to be covering tomorrow in some depth, and it's due out very soon as well. It's been in preview for some time, and we expect to see some news imminently in that space. So all of this, Purview, has been in the marketplace for some time. And as Lisa hinted, it started off, about 17 years ago from a Microsoft perspective. So what are we actually talking about for today? Another one of my fantastic diagrams, which is high on explanation and low on any graphic ability. But here we have the beginnings of a license. You can't do anything that we're talking about today without E5. Now, we had that conversation internally, a big argument, of course, because you can. There's lots of different meal deals you can choose, the bundling options, that is, to figure out, which components you actually need for your customers. Essentially, if they have an E5 license, they've got everything they need. And as Lisa mentioned as well, a lot of companies already have the E5 license because we're great at selling meal deals. They may not always be eating, though, or drinking the extra can or the packet of crisps they got as part of that meal deal, and therefore you may find that you get some utilization out of this without actually charging your customers anymore. Now, there's always a cost of servicing, of course, of managing these particular features, but from a customer's perspective, they may already have the license. If not, they need some form of E5. E3 gives you some features. E5 gives you the bits that we're talking about today. Now, you don't need a full E5. There are various SKUs you can then start diving into. There's a compliance one, there's an insider risk one even now as well, and they will give you most of the components you need to offer the full solution as well. So once the customer has the required licensing, we can start slotting in some of these building blocks to actually build up the IRM story. The first of these is data loss prevention. So we've just been talking essentially about that previous slide around MIP and being able to scan and then set policies around what we've actually discovered through that scanning. That's all part of DLP policies. So if you've got Project Gringot, I always use because I used to work in finance a lot, if you can get the reference, well done. If the term Project Gringot came up in a document, it will automatically be classified to merger team only, for example, and that's, you know, before the users even managed to type save on the Word document, it's already had a policy applied to it, which means it's encrypted, which means basically they can't share it beyond the immediate team members. So those policies are needed for what we're talking about now. Next up, we have HR data. So we're missing a little trick at the moment, and we're trying to find out why at the moment, but rather than taking a feed directly from HR, things like Workday perhaps, or some of the other common ones we typically work with, at the moment we have to go through a CSV format to pipe in the data from HR data into our IRM engine. Now the reason for that is they come in as certain sources of information, and you have to map the columns into the attributes as well. And there's quite a few different types of column depending what type of data you're trying to import. So there's one for resignation date, a leaving date, because of course they're often a month apart, or at least in the UK, it's typical to give 1 or 2 months notice. And therefore, if you know someone's leaving, that actually starts to put a little risk flag on their account, because if they suddenly start downloading lots of company assets that they normally wouldn't have bothered with, then of course that raises a little red flag, and then maybe storing up something quite nice to walk out the door with. Talking of doors, we can also do door control as well. So if Fred was always going into, let's say he worked in finance, he goes into the finance building on a daily basis, what he used to, of course, in the old world. If he suddenly starts going into maybe research or some other department with his own, obviously, set of office doors, then again, that's another risk flag, or it's a deviation from his normal pattern that can be fed into this engine as well. So door control is done through JSON files at the moment. And again, we're looking at an API to map these directly into the product as we mature it over time as well. Of course, there's some integration. We talked about it a moment ago, the endpoint DLP. So there is actually integration within Defender for Endpoint, so MDE, which allows us an extra set of controls and policies actually to light up inside a risk with, or give us more variables to actually measure and therefore call out when something suspicious happens. Active Directory, Azure Active Directory is still a key one. So you can go in and configure users who are more important than other users. And that is, of course, if you have maybe a project lead, a research lead, or some sort of exec lead, whatever it might be, then the risk associated with them leaving and taking information with them could be a lot more than certain other role types that exist within those customers as well. So you do get an idea of setting priority users as part of IRM. Comms compliance is not actually, strictly speaking, directly feeding in, but it forms part of the same story. We like to look at sentiment as well. So this is more around bullying, harassment, inappropriate language, perhaps in Teams or in an email. So we can start to measure that as well. We'll show a quick screenshot later. Comms compliance and insider risk management is all under the same dashboard, as are lots of the other compliance stories actually as well. And so they're quite closely related. Indeed, if you look at the docs pages, for example, on Microsoft, you'll see they come under the same general banner as well. So comms compliance will search out lots of interesting data for you from things like sentiment and context of that sentiment, of course, as well. And then IRM comes through with some of these other harder data sets, and together they give you a very nice view, actually, of what's happening within the organization. And finally, even if users start doing things on browsers, there is add-ons now which will track browser type access as well, and what they're actually trying to do. Are they trying to upload files via the browser to an FTP site? Very old school these days, of course, but those types of actions can be measured as well. So we are thinking about the sort of the more left field channels that some employees may be using to try and escape. And I'm not sure if you noticed on a previous slide, there was a big picture of an electric car. And that's possibly one of the most publicised examples of an employee leaving with information. And that, I'm pretty sure it was Tesla. I think 4 of them ended up leaving Tesla and setting up attempting to set up an extra a competing company with the same sort of blueprints used to set up the battery factories that Tesla were creating at the time as well. Now, they got caught through a series of different mishaps, actually. The biggest one was the ringleader emailed his old Tesla account, I think it was, and so they got caught fairly rapidly. But additionally, if you're going on to some web-based email platform, perhaps to try and extract some files, that's quite a nice way of doing it. In fact, in many ways, then of course we can still track that type of activity as well. So, in summary of this light blue row, we have lots of inputs, as it were, which can then start being built. Those inputs allow for certain templates to be used. So out of the box, that very virtual cloudy box, comes a set of templates as well. And we'll go through those in a moment because they provide a lot of visibility of how the mechanics works as well. Templates make policies. So that's how you then construct your own policies for your customers. That's when the nice, clever machine learning algorithm then starts to play a part. And then you can start then triaging alerts as we go through this, do the actual investigations on the ones that are real, as it were, and then you start going up to the action page as well. So this is roughly the order of how all this happens. You get a license, you make sure all the extra bits are lit up, you then implement the policies that these extra bits allow you to, from a template, sorry, and from those you start building the policies that are applicable to the customer you're working with. A policy produces an alert, they get triaged, they get investigated if needed, and then if it does turn into something deeply suspicious, of course, you then have the action statement as well. And the actions are quite interesting. And I'll spend a couple of minutes on this one actually, and then hopefully rattle through the few remaining slides. One action will be, not just yet, although strictly speaking you could do it if you really wanted to, a bit of manual effort, but we're making it easier very soon, is you can input these alerts into Sentinel. Now, yesterday, if you were lucky enough to be on that call as well, then you would have heard me say that you pipe everything into Sentinel. It is the great database of security alerts. Therefore, you can start mapping X, Y, and Z together to form a better picture of what's going on. Yesterday, we're talking about IoT alerts going in. Today, we're talking about insider risk or risky employee alerts now being fed into Sentinel as well. Sentinel collects data from all sorts of places, of course, so it starts to string together lots of disparate bits of information into one particular incident. That's one example. There is a connector coming out for IRM in the near future. Not quite sure when yet, probably in the next, I imagine, 3 to 4 months to give it a rough time frame. And you're going to plug these alerts directly in. We're talking e-discovery later, of course, but if you discover that Fred's been deeply suspicious, then of course you might want to actually discover what Fred's been up to exactly, and that's an e-discovery case, and that gives you the sort of next level of automation, next level of analysis of what Fred's been up to. Or you could automate. There may be some, you may be able to set some of Fred's permissions perhaps to restrict them before he actually walks out the door, so between resignation and leaving dates, for example. And again, Ali's got a couple of ideas around automation, which we'll hopefully demonstrate earlier. And then a word of warning, and it's an interesting word of warning, this one, which is why we've got these two other icons on this particular slide. So some of the components that make up, obviously, IRM as well have been used in the past, of course, some of the engines that sort of feed in data. And we've worked with some partners in early stages, as it were, before releasing a lot of this. And that is, quite often we'll go in and run a proof of concept. The whole aim of today, by the way, is to get you to run a proof of concept, as it was yesterday, and as it will be for tomorrow as well. So we want you to go into your customers and actually run this. Now, one of the things we have found is sometimes we find something, well, pretty much all the time we find something, of course, but sometimes we find something quite red hot, as in, I never knew he was leaving. Why is he going onto the research database? He's had no reason to touch that database, and why is he downloading all the blueprints for Factory V2? And so at this point, HR have been called in. So the meeting has been stopped as we've been doing the review. HR has been contacted, said, look, we need to escort this guy off site pretty much immediately, actually. We need to lock down his access now. It looks like he's extracting loads of data. And in one case, we even had security walking in because the guy in concern was actually in the review meeting, funnily enough, policing himself. And therefore, we had some heavies walk into the room to lift him up and cart him outside. So when you're doing it on production data, one as in a proof of concept style approach, one of the warnings is just be careful what you find, because it could actually be very relevant, obviously, when you're doing that briefing back to the customer as well. So, and also, of course, helps enormously with actually selling the managed service to the end customer. So every cloud, silver lining. So what are these templates? So how are we doing? We've got a couple of minutes. I'll let you read this slide at your own leisure. There are, there's about 10 templates that come out the box at the moment. A lot of these are in preview, as you can possibly see at the moment. I have spent some time developing a classification system. There we are. So you can see roughly what they actually apply to. That's priority users, a little crown, by the way. Leaking data. And so the only one that's probably worth a little bit more conversation, because you can read these by yourself, on which information feeds they need to actually activate, is the IRM analytics one. It doesn't require any actually additional information. You can just switch this on day one. It takes an entire day to run, because it works on the previous 24 hours worth of data, and it will start to classify suspicious events for you as it sees it. So you don't need any policies set up, you don't need any any of these HR connectors, etc. running. Just as soon as you have it activated, switch on the little switch on the cloud box, and off it will go and start analysing all the data. And it generally, in most large organisations, that is, it will generally find a few things for you to actually explain to a customer without having anything else set up. Now, if during the creation of your proof of concept or your pilot, you have the opportunity to load in additional sources of employee activity data, let's call it, then MDE is obviously a fantastic source if it happens to be there, but without a doubt, probably the HR connector is one of the most important. So it is worth the time. It's not that difficult. It's a little bit fiddly, let's say, rather than complex. You do need to produce some CSV files with the right headings on the columns to make sure the right data is coming in the right format into that IRM policy engine. But that's where you get some of the really interesting stuff come in. So things like annual reviews, are they on a, what does Microsoft call them, a personal improvement plan, which is obviously you get 6 months to prove yourself or you're out. That type of data can all be part of those HR CSV files, which then get imported. Very briefly now, because I'm eating into Ali's time, which is the demo time, which I know is probably more exciting, but IRM lives in compliance.microsoft.com. If you've got Eagle Vision, you might just be able to spot that at the top. And all of the compliance bits now sit in here. So a big change over the last couple of months if you've not been here for a while. So you can see insider risk is down here, comms compliance is here as well. So it does sit in the same area. And some of the extra bits we'll be talking about tomorrow, privacy management, of course, later on today, e-discovery, etc., all exist in this particular site as well. And this is more of a summary, actually, quite nicely for us. We come across a lot of partners doing POCs on dummy data. It is quite hard to do it on dummy data because nothing brings it home like showing that Fred in accounting is actually doing something now, rather than some contrived data, which of course is what we're using in a minute, but that's to explain obviously the mechanics of it working rather than trying to sell the service to an end customer. So nothing helps a real sell like running on real data. You can use the analytic mode without having to do any of the other inputs and just leave it running for a few days to start creating some incidents for you to explain to a customer as well. And therefore you don't have to think about piping in data. And even if you do, there's a warning again, by the way, if something is discovered, what will generally happen if you do pipe in your own data is after a few days, this is my tenant, or I had piped in a load of data and had it all running quite nicely. Typically after 7 days, it all starts to remove itself. Because some of the policies only look back on the past 7 days to give you an idea of what's actually happening. Some look about 30, some look about more, but the point is it goes stale quite rapidly without real data actually flowing into the platform, so just be aware. This one, slightly over, so we're going to jump through. Same as yesterday, if you're on the call, if you are a partner and you're managing multiple customers, they've obviously each customer will be running IRM. In a few months' time, those alerts will be fed into Sentinel, and then you can manage Sentinel, you can monitor Sentinel centrally from your partner-based SOC. As we talked about yesterday with IoT, compliance is another one of those that lends itself to be managed across multiple customers from a central partner-managed SOC. If there's more questions on this, it's probably beyond the time we have at the moment. We might be able to answer some of those in the questions. Very similar set of questions to yesterday, but if you weren't on yesterday's call, of course, then feel free. Essentially, you run Sentinel in the partner SOC, or for want of a better term, whatever central managing platform that you have. Every customer then runs Sentinel as well, and they connect into sources of information that's going to be interesting to them, or to you from a management perspective. And then when you run it from here, it allows you then to analyze lots of different customers in one go. So you can manage multiple customers from a single screen. Very powerful, quite clever, and we'll dig into that in more detail if there's need to be. Otherwise, and that's where it links in as well. Yeah, some links. There's a great POC in a pot. That's my name, not the official one. There are some links which I think we're going to post very soon as well. Docs.Microsoft, of course, is fantastic. If you are a registered partner, then you'll be able to get to one of the main demos, which is on CDX Transform. And then we always get asked about exams. I'm not sure why people are so keen on them, but there is SC 400 now, which is around information protection, of course. Relatively new exam that came out earlier this year. So with that, I think we'll start to dive into the demo instead. And as a brief summary, same as yesterday's slide, POC, and hopefully one of those will turn into a cell, of course, as well. There's nothing quite like running IRM on live customer data. That's when suddenly they start seeing the value and start seeing the value of obviously whatever pricing point it is going to be for managing it for them, and then of course then lead into a sale. So POC in production, if you can, it's far more valuable, and hopefully that will lead obviously to some future sales for both of us. So with that, I shall hand over to Ali, and hopefully we'll see some of this in action.